The first thing you must understand about the world we call Mortuus, the world my meticulous scribe training compels me to record, is that the most terrifying thing about it is not the rot. It is the Yuk stability. The air inside the administratum archive where I maintain my vigil smells perpetually of canned peaches left out in the rain. It's a sweet cloying odor, damp sugar and decay underlaid with the metallic tang of old copper. It's the scent of perpetual autumn. An endless soft senescence where nothing is sharp, nothing is clean, and nothing ever quite dies. I started my day, as always, by checking the environmentals. My hands, still steady despite the faint, persistent tremor beneath the skin, ran over the brass plaque detailing the archive's previous dedication for the unswerving will of the God Emperor. The plaque was almost entirely obscured by a layer of pale green mildew soft as velvet. I logged the humidity 98%. The temperature, a constant, unnaturally warm 25 degrees Celsius. My anchor to sanity is routine. And data. Even if the data now proves the stability of my own damnation, I am Ilara, Administratum Scribe, grade Gamma 9. I was stranded here during the fall, one of the countless forgotten cogs in the imperial bureaucracy. While the guardsmen fought a brief, brutal, and utterly futile battle against the soft, swollen tides of the plague fleet, my duty was to stay and log the inventory. The inventory is now a record of our slow, comfortable descent into entropy. My desk is my barricade. It sits under a collapsed section of the ceiling, where the pale, green-tinged light of Mortuus struggles through a thick layer of fungal blooms. I dip my pen, a cheap synthetic stick pilfered from a now empty supply closet, into the inkwell. The ink is my greatest current struggle. It is mixed with the spores that float ceaselessly in the archive's atmosphere, giving it a greasy brown-green sheen. It doesn't write. It bleeds out into the corrupted parchment. Day 780 since primary bioseeding. External atmosphere saturation remains 100%. Wind speed is negligible. Observed fungal growth on sarcophagus unit 4. Increased by 0.3. I write this down. My heart a dull, hammering thing against my ribs, because if I stop recording the chaos becomes my reality. The true hook, the reason I wake up and keep logging, is the desperate need to prove that the logic of the Imperium is still greater than the soft indifference of chaos. But the world outside my four mildewed walls is whispering a different truth. Just as I finished logging the growth on sarcophagus unit 4, I don't know what's in SU4, but its steady swelling is a reliable data point. I felt it, a profound, slow, rhythmic vibration, not through the floor but through the structure itself. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a heartbeat, but it was close. A deep, massive percussion, felt more than heard. It came from somewhere far beneath the administratum bunker, an engine perhaps, or something colossal moving with slow, terrible purpose. I dropped my pen, the green ink pooling instantly. I stared at the ceiling where the pale light filtered through the corruption. The sound wasn't threatening. It was just there, stable, rhythmic. And I realized with a terrifying, cold certainty that sliced through the warm, sweet air that the stability of my decay was not accidental. It was being maintained. I grabbed a fresh sheet of paper, ignoring the pulsing rhythm vibrating through my desk. I had to know the origin of the thump. I had to log the engine of this soft, creeping horror. I had to leave the archive, and that meant stepping out into the gardens of the dying sun. The ledger is my fortress. Not the mildewed walls, but the pages themselves, the rigid columns, the clean Roman numerals, the certainty of the data recorded in neat, controlled lines. This is the logic of the administratum, which even on a Nurgle world must prevail. I ran my fingertip over the parchment. The page was damp, soft like old velvet, already beginning to display faint green-brown mottling. It was a terrifying sign. The archive's internal corruption had accelerated, targeting the paper fibers, the very foundation of my records. I dipped my synthetic pen into the well, intending to log the thump I'd heard moments ago. But the ink, my precious controlled instrument, was failing. It didn't flow smoothly. It dragged, thick and viscous. When I pressed it to the parchment, it did not set in a crisp line. It bled, a dark, sickly bloom that spread instantly, carrying minute fungal spores into the paper fibers. It felt like a betrayal. The world wasn't just rotting around me, it was rotting through my system of control. Log entry: sub-level acoustic anomaly. Source: unknown. Nature: rhythmic, low-frequency percussion. Temporal consistency: high. I forced myself to rewrite the entry, meticulously blotting the bleeding ink. The struggle to maintain clarity, to impose the black and white logic of the Imperium onto this soft green reality, was exhausting. I leaned back, resting my head against the cold, mildewed wall, and let my mind drift back, not for comfort, but for necessary context. The chaos that had brought us here. I remembered the invasion not as a glorious battle, there was none, but as a soft, endless rain. The sky, once blue and proud, had simply thickened, turning into a low, green-tinged ceiling. The first ships of the plague fleet didn't bombard, they simply drifted down, immense swollen forms that ruptured on impact, spewing not fire but vast clouds of heavy, sweet-smelling spores. The garrison fought, of course, for maybe 5 hours. But the spores settled, coating everything in a sickeningly soft mantle of comfortable decay. The guardsmen's armor rusted in minutes. Their wounds didn't bleed out, but instantly bloomed into slow, painless fungal flowers. The air filled with that inescapable cloying scent, the smell of perpetual autumn, and the will to fight simply dissolved. My memory of the last hours of the Imperial occupation is failing. It's not trauma that causes the lapse, it's the environment itself. The spores, the humidity, the comforting warmth, it's dissolving the sharp edges of my mind, softening the trauma into mere data. I cling to the routine because without the routine, I am just another piece of softening matter on Mortuus. Suddenly, the archive's stillness broke. Thump, thump, thump. The rhythmic percussion returned, louder this time, shaking the metal desk. It was impossibly slow, the pulse of something vast and unhurried, and it lasted for 10 agonizing cycles before subsiding. It felt like the world was breathing. I stared down at the bleeding entry in my ledger. I couldn't log the source from inside. The logic demanded observation. The imperial truth demanded proof. The administratum scribe demanded a complete record. I realized with a cold clarity that the single most necessary piece of data, the origin of the thump, the engine that maintained this stable decay, lay outside. I closed the ledger, carefully securing my pen and blotting the last smear of green ink. My hands, still slightly trembling, moved to the heavy, rusted bolt of the archive door. I had to step out. I had to venture into the gardens of the dying sun. The archive door bolt protested, a long, mournful screech of rust against steel that sounded impossibly loud in the deep silence. For 780 days, that door had been the absolute boundary between the logic of the Imperium, my ledger, and the soft indifference of chaos, the outside. I stepped out. The air, already thick with the sweet, cloying decay of my bunker, hit me with a shocking intensity. It wasn't merely the smell of perpetual autumn anymore. It was the scent of a billion things dying gently and simultaneously. A deep fungal musk that was strangely warm and suffocatingly comforting. My lungs contracted against the urge to recoil. I focused on the task. Locate the source of the thump. Log the engine of entropy. The cityscape that greeted me was a silent testament to Nurgle's terrible patience. It wasn't the charred ruin of a defeated world. It was a bloated garden. The angular, proud structures of the imperial city were still recognizable, but they had been softened. The stone and metal of the towers had yielded, merging into a continuous, spongy gray-green growth. The edges were rounded. Windows were obscured by thick, gelatinous films. The very concrete looked soft, as if made of stale bread dough. It was the living architecture, a city that was less a ruin and more a single, gigantic, sick-breathing organism. I moved forward, my boots sinking slightly into a thick layer of pale velvety mold that covered the plaza. The usual chaotic sounds of a hive city, the roar of flyers, the grinding of transport wheels, the shouts of the populace, were completely absent. The silence was profound, broken only by the low, continuous hum of decay. It was the lack of violence that terrified me. The imperial truth is forged in fire and conflict. This world had simply forgotten how to fight, forgotten how to resist. It had accepted the rot with a terrifying, profound apathy. I realized then why the thump had been so unsettling. The rhythmic percussion wasn't just coming from below. It was coming from the environment's own, the internal maintenance. The low hum I heard was the sound of the city's vast fungal network slowly, stably processing the organic matter beneath. I approached a former transport line. The massive metal rail car was still there, but it was unrecognizable. Its wheels had disappeared, absorbed by a huge spherical mass of pale green tissue that pulsed gently. The doors, swollen shut, were marked by thick black weeping spots. It was death, but rendered entirely safe, rendered permanent. As I sketched the swollen railcar in my ledger, the rhythmic sound returned. Thump, thump, thump. Closer this time. It felt like a vast heart beating deep within the earth, reminding me of its unhurried, monumental presence. The vibration traveled up through the spongy mold and into my boots. A slow, gentle pulse that carried no malice, only certainty. I raised my eyes to the highest spire, the original location of the city's Vox antenna. It was visible barely through the shrouding cloud cover, its summit crowned by a massive pale green fungal cap. That was the logical source of a large, continuous mechanical thump. Some final, massive mechanism still operating, perhaps even feeding the spores to the upper atmosphere. I knew my course. I had to reach that spire. I had to log the engine of this entropic paradise. I was recording the final moments of a civilization, and even here my administratum training would not allow an incomplete entry. My duty was to log the death, however soft, however stable. The imperial truth had to survive the gardens of the dying sun. I had not been outside the bunker for long, but the oppressive stability of the corruption was already wearing on my composure. My hands, normally steady, felt damp and slow, almost resistant to gripping the pen. I forced myself to walk, my boots crushing the velvety mold underfoot, navigating the soft, swollen ruins toward the high spire. The pale, sickly green sky, which had been a constant, low ceiling since the fall, began to thicken. I braced myself for the weather. On an imperial world, rain is life, or at least clean water. Here I knew it would be a catalyst. The first drops were not sharp or cold. They were warm, large, and unctuously viscous, hitting the spongy ground with a wet splat. The air immediately intensified, smelling strongly of copper, brine, and sweet concentrated rot. This was the gift of the rain, the Nurgle World's unique form of precipitation, and it was horrifyingly efficient. It wasn't destructive. It didn't wash the world clean, it fed it. As the thick, green-tinged rain began to fall in earnest, the spongy architecture around me visibly swelled, gulping the liquid. The fungal blooms grew subtly faster, their colors deepening from pale green to vibrant, sickly bronze. I pulled the hood of my tattered administratum robe over my head, though it did little to ward off the saturation. The liquid felt oily, clinging to the fabric, and then I saw them, the pustulants. They emerged from the shadows and soft tissue doorways of the surrounding buildings drawn by the rain. They were the former inhabitants of this city, now transformed into Nurgle's complacent flock. They were bloated, slow, and terrifyingly passive. Their skin, where visible, was spongy and pale green, covered in small, harmless-looking pustules that wept clear fluid. They moved with a gentle, unhurried gait, their steps silent on the moldy ground. What chilled me was not their grotesque appearance, but their contentment. They weren't shambling, violent zombies driven by rage or hunger. They were peaceful. They simply stood in the downpour, holding out their swollen, rudimentary hands, gathering the rain into crude, bowl-like indentations in their own flesh. It was a display of horrifying, utter apathy. They had accepted the decay not with resignation, but with a profound, terrifying comfort. They had been given the gift of stability, the gift of release from the anxiety of resistance. I froze behind the swollen husk of a former HAB unit, carefully sketching the scene into my damp ledger. I logged the pustulants' average girth, their speed, and the lack of any observable fear response. The logical, meticulous observation was the only shield I had left. The rhythmic thump, which had faded during my hurried walk, returned with the intensity of the downpour. Thump, thump, thump. It felt synchronized with the gentle splat of the viscous rain hitting the ground. The engine, the life support system of Mortuus, was working in perfect harmony with the environment. It produced the decay, and the decay fed the engine. A stable, terrifying cycle. As I recorded the pustulant's unhurried movements, one figure, larger than the rest, turned its pale, soft face toward my hiding spot. Its features were indistinct, rounded by growth, but the vacant contentment of its posture was clear. It wasn't looking at me. It was simply looking in my direction, radiating a massive, crushing wave of apathy. My administratum training demanded I flee the possibility of exposure, but my scribe's duty was paramount. I had to log the specifics of the soft people. I had to understand how a civilization could forget to die, and instead embrace the rot. I lowered my head, sheltering my ledger from the corrosive, gentle rain. I had to get closer. The pustulants held the key to the nature of Nurgle's terrible, stable peace, and the truth had to be logged, no matter the cost to my own fading sanity. The rain receded, leaving the landscape dripping, spongy, and glistening with that sickly green moisture. The air was now thick with the scent of accelerated growth and decay, a potent, suffocating perfume. I pushed away from the clammy wall. Of the abandoned hab unit, my administratum robes heavy and cold with the oily rain. I had logged the visual data on the pustulants' appearance and their silent, horrifying passivity. Now, I need to log their behavior, their purpose. I followed the largest group, moving cautiously through the overgrown plaza. My movement felt rough, clumsy, and loud compared to the absolute stillness of the world. My boots sank into the mold with a slight squish, a sound that felt like sacrilege in this quiet temple of entropy. The pustulants had gathered around a vast patch of earth where the fungal growth was particularly thick and swollen. The ground here was mounded high, pale green and slightly translucent, pulsing faintly with internal liquid. It looked like a giant festering bruise on the planet's surface. They began their activity. It didn't work. It was a soft step ceremony. They moved with profound, deliberate slowness. Their bloated bodies swayed gently, their steps lifting and placing their large, spongy feet onto the swollen mound with meticulous, painstaking care. The movement was a slow, ritualistic dance, unhurried, repetitive, and deeply unsettlingly peaceful. There was no sound from them, no chant, no moan, no grunt of effort. Only the quiet thump of the slow percussion returning, synchronized now not with the rain, but with their slow, deliberate steps. Thump, soft step. Thump, soft step. It was as though they were guiding the planet's slow, morbid heartbeat, ensuring the stability of the corruption. They were cultivating the soft rot. I found cover behind the fungal remains of a massive imperial statue, sketching the movements rapidly in my ledger, the pencil lead leaving deep indentations in the damp paper. I logged the precise angle of their swaying, the average duration of each step, and the absence of any signs of distress or impatience. The profound lack of anxiety radiating from the pustulants was the true horror. They were not suffering the fate of chaos, they were embracing it with a quiet, terrifying joy. Their existence was pure acceptance. They had been freed from all the imperial burdens, duty, fear, and the relentless pressure to maintain order. As one pustulant completed a slow turn, the motion brought its face into profile. The swollen flesh obscured most features, but I saw what looked like a remnant of an old, tattered administratum band on its wrist, now encased in pale, soft tissue. A former colleague, a reminder of my own inescapable fate, rendered utterly complacent. The ritual continued. The pustulant's slow, patient steps were applying pressure to the swollen earth, encouraging the soft tissue beneath. They were nurturers of the decay. I realized I wasn't just observing a ritual, I was observing the engine of this stability. The corruption wasn't fighting the world, it was incorporating it, and the former inhabitants were now the happy, soft-stepping gardeners of their own decay. I had to get closer to verify the physical condition of the participants, to log the catalog of their quiet grief. I needed to see if the erased fear was worth the monstrous exchange. My scribe's duty demanded an objective catalog of the soft people, even if the truth threatened to turn my own sharp imperial certainty into soft gray-green mold. The necessity of the scribe is precision. I could not simply log grotesque peaceful blob. I needed data points. I needed to log the physical metrics of Nurgle's embrace, transforming subjective horror into objective, repeatable imperial truth. This was my Varnan catalog of grief. The pustulants were still engaged in their soft step ceremony over the swollen mound, their backs mostly to me. The low rhythmic thump continued, synchronized with their slow sways. The silence coupled with the immense, passive bodies made me feel acutely visible. Despite my tattered gray-brown robes, I moved slow and low, utilizing the decaying remnants of imperial architecture as cover. The mold under my boots made no sound, only a soft, wet squish that felt loud only to my own conscience. I reached the base of the massive, spherical fungal bloom that had consumed the imperial statue. From this vantage point, I was terrifyingly close enough to smell the specifics of the decay. It wasn't just sweet, it was tinged with the metallic musk of old dried blood and something sharply acidic, like old citrus fruit. I opened my ledger, placing the damp parchment against the clammy surface of the fungal growth for support. My hands, despite the lingering tremor, became the rigid instruments of the administratum. I began to sketch. The first pustulant was massive, its limbs thick and rounded. Its joints seemed to have fused, forcing it into that gentle, continuous sway. I cataloged the color. Pale, sickly jade green with sporadic, deep bronze spots. The texture spongy and wet, reflecting the dim light like damp velvet. I meticulously noted the primary deformities, transforming them into technical data. Subject 780 alpha, pustulant prime, cranial mass distortion, ratio 1.5.1, complete obscuration of nasal and auditory canals by pale epithelial growth, lack of defensive motor functions observed. Subject 780 beta, abdominal girth, approx 2.1 meters circumference. Noted a distinct slow fluid leakage from a series of harmless-looking pustules on the upper torso. Fluid is clear, viscous, and immediately absorbed by the air. As I finished the sketch of subject beta, my eyes caught a detail that froze my pen midway across the page. Near the wrist of subject gamma, where the swollen flesh met the pale spongy growth, was a fragment of fabric. It was dirty, almost entirely degraded, but the threads were unmistakably the faded drab khaki of an Imperial Guard uniform. A tiny tattered remnant of an old faded unit patch was still visible near the cuff. The sight was a physical shock. This wasn't some anonymous chaos cultist. This was one of the forgotten defenders, now fully assimilated. The catalog of grief had become a record of personal, intimate loss. I forced myself to sketch the fragment, logging the data with a surge of cold, professional intensity. It was the only way to hold the mounting, visceral revulsion at bay. The pustulant subject gamma shifted. Its slow, soft movement brought its face slightly closer to my hiding place. It paused its sway, the single act of stillness unnerving. It wasn't threatening, but it was aware. The creature's vacant, swollen eyes seemed to register my presence, yet it projected no malice. Only that overwhelming, crushing apathy and profound comfort. It was a testament to Nurgle's most insidious power, the erasure of the will to resist. I secured my ledger, the pencil vibrating slightly in my hand. I had the data. I had the terrifying confirmation that the inhabitants were former servants of the Emperor, now trapped in this morbid, stable peace. My duty as scribe was fulfilled, but my sanity was threadbare. I had to withdraw before the soft people realized the Imperial Order still existed, however tenuously inside my head. I backed away, leaving the soft step ceremony to their gentle, unhurried cultivation. I was returning to my archive carrying the full, gruesome weight of the world's quiet, stable death. And I now knew where this relentless, perpetual autumn originated, not from a place of rage, but from a place of sickening, eternal rest. I should have withdrawn after logging the Imperial Guard uniform fragment. That was the logical end of the catalog of grief. But the true scribe knows that data points are useless without context. I needed to understand the emotional state of the soft people. I remained concealed near the fungal-consumed statue, watching the pustulants conclude their slow, hypnotic, soft-step ceremony. The rhythmic thump had faded again, leaving the air heavy and quiet, charged only by the scent of sweet, pervasive rot. My mind, rigid and analytical, was fighting a losing battle against the world's insidious comfort. The persistent warmth, the lack of sharp edges, the absence of threats, it was all designed to dissolve the imperial will. I focused on the cold, hard memory of duty. The pustulants began to disperse, their movements as unhurried and passive as always. I waited, ready to make my retreat back to the relative sanity of the archive. But as Subject Gamma, the one with the faded uniform fragment, passed my hiding place, it paused. Its swollen, shapeless mass stopped, and it tilted its head slowly, its featureless, vacant eyes turning directly toward my location. There was no aggression, no hungry rush of violence, only stillness, and that was worse than any attack. I froze. Bolt pistol, a useless relic in this fungal environment, half drawn beneath my robes. My heart hammered, a frantic, loud thing against my ribs, convinced that the sight of my fear would provoke a reaction. The pustulant took one slow, deliberate step toward me, then another. The mold under its spongy foot made a gentle squish. It was immense, overwhelming, and utterly silent. I braced myself for the impact, the inevitable absorption into the soft, comforting decay. But the creature did not strike. It simply reached out its enormous, pale, spongy hand. It was a slow, deliberate gesture of gentle contact. The palm of its hand was surprisingly soft, like cold, damp leather. It settled lightly on my shoulder. The moment of physical contact was not painful. It was overwhelming. I was instantly flooded by an enormous, crushing wave of apathy and serene resignation. It wasn't channeled aggression. It was pure, simple, unshakable peace. I felt the sudden, terrifying absence of pain and anxiety radiating from the creature. Not the absence of life, but the absence of suffering. All the human instincts I relied upon, the fight-or-flight reflex, the chronic anxiety of failure, the fear of death, were utterly nullified in its presence. It was the ultimate, insidious gift of Nurgle, the erasure of fear. The pustulant didn't want to hurt me. It wanted to share its morbid comfort. I recoiled violently, shoving the creature away with a gasp. My movement was chaotic and desperate, snapping me out of the psychological trap. The pustulant stumbled slightly, regaining its balance with unhurried slowness, its vacant eyes showing no confusion, no anger, no distress at the rejection. Only a profound, steady contentment. I ran. I sprinted back toward the archive, my feet slipping on the mold. The sweet, cloying smell of perpetual autumn felt suddenly repugnant. I was shaking not from fear of injury, but from the raw, intimate terror of having my will erased. I slammed the rusted bolt home on the archive door, leaning against the cold, mildewed metal, breathing hard. I had the data. I knew the pustulants were content, saved from the ultimate anxiety of life. And I knew with terrible certainty that my own mind was not immune to Nurgle's ultimate gift. I had to continue my records. I had to cling to the sharp, painful logic of the Imperium before the soft rot took away my will to resist. The archive was safe for now, but the psychological war had just begun. The rusted bolt slammed home with a jarring, absolute finality. I leaned against the door, hyperventilating, the smell of canned peaches and mildew now my temporary salvation. I was safe from the soft people, but not from the psychological horror of their terrifying peace. My mind was a chaotic mess of cold data and visceral revulsion. Fact: the pustulants are former Imperial citizens. Fact: their condition removes anxiety and pain. Conclusion: Nurgle's gift is psychological stability at the cost of identity. My scribe brain furiously tried to file the data under acceptable losses for planetary stability. but my imperial conscience filed it under heresy absolute. I needed to log the encounter. I needed to solidify the moment of contact, the feeling of that soft, spongy hand, before the environmental comfort dissolved the sharp edges of the memory. I moved to my desk, my fortress, and reached for my ledger, the sacred record. But as my hand settled upon the damp parchment, I froze. The ledger was not as I had left it. It was open to the page where I had meticulously logged the observed fungal growth on sarcophagus Unit 4. Directly in the center of the clean, ruled paper, just beside the line detailing the temperature, was a small, pulsing fungal bloom. It was pale green, slightly translucent, and about the size of a Terran thumbprint. It was alive, growing, right on the paper, defying the chemical composition of the ink. It radiated a sickening, subtle warmth. This was not mold growing on the walls. This was mnemonic fungus, growing specifically on my record, my anchor to sanity. The realization brought a cold spike of fear far sharper than any I had felt in the presence of the postulant. The enemy had found the flaw in my defense. I snatched the ledger away, holding it up to the dim green light filtering through the ceiling. The small bloom wasn't just on the paper, it was consuming the ink. The lines of my meticulous logging were dissolving under the soft, insidious touch of the fungus. The data was fading, being replaced by the soft, biological uniformity of Nurgle's garden. I ran a desperate finger over the paper, brushing the fungal bloom away. It came off easily, leaving a faint, greasy residue and a terrible smear of green where the ink had been. The data was gone, the record was blank. "No," I whispered, the sound raw and desperate. "You will not erase the data." I grabbed my synthetic pen, dipping it furiously into the thickened ink. I had to relog the entry immediately. I had to fight the decay of the truth with the rigid discipline of the administratum. As I forced the pen to scribe the missing numbers, I realized the fungus wasn't just consuming the ink. It was consuming the memory represented by the ink. My mental image of sarcophagus Unit 4, its exact height, its precise mildew pattern, was blurred, softened by the environmental comfort and the fungus's localized assault. I was logging a guess. The imperial truth was becoming a subjective lie. The low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump from the structure below returned, louder and more insistent than before. It wasn't the sound of a threat. It was the sound of a patient, massive entity waiting for the process to complete. I clamped the ledger shut, securing it with a rusted clasp. My survival no longer depended on logging the daily decay, but on logging the ultimate truth. The complete, uncensored data had to be transmitted. I looked at the small, salvaged data slate hidden under my desk. I couldn't trust the parchment or the ink anymore. I had to compile every note I had, bypass the city's corrupted communications, and send a final report detailing the full, stable horror of the gardens of the dying sun. I had to reach the Vox antenna spire. I had to climb high enough to escape the mnemonic rot and log the world's quiet death before the fungus erased my will to resist entirely. The fight was leaving the archive and moving to the highest point of the planet. The archive, once a sanctuary, was now compromised. The very paper I used to anchor my sanity was growing the mnemonic fungus, turning imperial truth into biological oblivion. There was no time left for meticulous daily logs. The final record had to be made, and it had to be sent. I secured the old salvaged data slate beneath my tattered administratum robes. It contained every entry I had meticulously logged: the rising humidity, the consumption rates of the living architecture, the horrific contentment of the postulants, and the location of the faded Imperial Guard patch. This was the pure data, uncorrupted by spores. My objective was clear, driven by the cold, logical imperative of the administratum: transmission. I stepped out of the bunker, the pervasive, sweet decay now merely a backdrop to my grim focus. I raised my gaze to the city's highest point, the massive, fungal-choked spire where the Imperial Vox antenna lay. It loomed through the sickly green sky, an immense oxidized needle. Its original function as a beacon of Imperial communication almost entirely obscured by Nurgle's aesthetic. Its summit was crowned by a colossal, pale green fungal cap. That antenna, that relic of Imperial communication, was likely the source of the persistent rhythmic thump I had been recording since Chapter 1. It wasn't the sound of an engine starting. It was the slow rhythmic sound of a massive, corrupted machine struggling to maintain its base function, battling entropy itself. I began the slow, arduous trek through the gardens of the dying sun, moving away from the safety of the administratum ruins and into the open, overgrown plaza. The ground beneath my feet was thick with spongy mold and pale, resistant fungal growths that offered no solid footing. The danger now was less the pustulants, who were passive, and more the environment. The very materials of the city were hostile, yet in Nurgle's fashion, hostile with comfort. A misplaced step wouldn't lead to a jagged fall, but a slow, engulfing sink into soft, nutrient-rich decay. I passed a vast stretch of pavement that had become a field of low-lying, bulbous growths. They pulsed faintly, their surfaces glistening with the oily rain residue. I focused on the sheer will required to keep walking, to resist the soft, seductive urge to simply lie down and let the perpetual autumn claim me. My focus returned to the Vox antenna spire. It looked impossibly tall, a final monumental act of Imperial arrogance now rendered into a vertical garden of decay. As I neared the base of the spire, I caught sight of the structure's lowest maintenance rungs, thick, corroded loops of iron spiraling up the oxidized metal tower. They were my only route. The ascent wouldn't be a fight against enemies, but a slow, agonizing war against entropy. The rust was thick, the metal compromised, and the ubiquitous fungal matter would coat every step. I paused at the base, looking up the dizzying height. The rhythmic thump was now much louder, vibrating through the massive base plate beneath my feet, confirming the corruption was active, alive, and vast. My duty was simple: climb high enough to breach the environmental interference, splice my data slate into the ancient, corrupted Vox terminal, and send the final, unadulterated record of Mortuus to the Imperium. Even if the Imperium was too far away and my message too late, the truth had to be logged. I touched the first maintenance rung. It was cold, wet, and unsettlingly soft with a thick layer of fungal growth. The final ascent to logic was about to begin. The massive iron base plate of the Vox antenna spire thrummed beneath my boots with the slow rhythmic thump, the heartbeat of this morbid world. It was louder now, a physical pressure confirming the structure was active and vast. I gripped the first rung of the maintenance ladder. It wasn't cold iron. It was unsettlingly soft with a thick layer of spongy gray-green growth. This was the ascent of entropy, a climb not against gravity but against decay. I started upward. Every handhold was a struggle. The rust had done its work, turning the metal rungs porous, and the fungal matter was resistant and slick with oily residue. My progress was agonizingly slow, each upward movement requiring immense mental effort to resist the soft, seductive urge to simply stop, rest, and let the process of assimilation begin. I climbed past the remnants of the spire's dedication plaque. It was now a canvas of bulbous pale green sacs. They didn't burst. They merely pressed against the metal, patiently waiting for the structural integrity to yield. The air thinned slightly as I rose, becoming less humid, but the sweetness of the rot intensified, like smelling a single giant ancient flower. I could see the city spread out below, a silent, vast carpet of soft, overgrown ruins utterly devoid of movement. A graveyard rendered into a giant, stable greenhouse. Halfway up the spire, where the atmosphere began to clear the worst of the ground-level fungal choke, I encountered an obstacle that froze my ascent. Clinging to the metal framework, where a structural support strut met a main power conduit, was a preserved skeleton of an Imperial guardsman. He was still in a full, heavy suit of flak armor, but the metal, the leather, and the bone beneath were entirely encased in a smooth, pale, hardened fungal tissue. He wasn't decayed in the traditional sense. He had been perfectly preserved, entombed in his final position. His hand was still raised, pointing upward, perhaps trying to signal a warning before the spores claimed him. I paused, resting my chest against the cold, spongy ladder rung, and reached out to touch the grisly relic. The fungal tissue was smooth and unnervingly firm, like porcelain. It felt entirely safe, entirely stable, This was Nurgle's final mockery, eternal stasis. The guardsman hadn't died a chaotic, violent death. He had simply been absorbed into the living architecture, preserved as a morbid statue of his final futile effort. His sacrifice was rendered meaningless not by defeat, but by perpetual stasis. I logged the observation mentally, cataloging the density and color of the tissue, data that would never reach the administratum, but data I desperately needed to maintain my own sanity. The rhythmic thump from the antenna base continued, slow and patient, vibrating up the metal structure and into my body. It felt like the beating heart of the preserved guardsman, still counting the seconds of his endless fixed duty. I pushed past the macabre statue, forcing my focus back to the Vox terminal above. The guardsman's skeletal preserved finger pointed the way. My duty was not to be a preserved statue, but to be the final voice. The climb was slow agony, but with every meter the air grew slightly clearer, and the light from the dying sun, filtered through the green-tinged clouds, grew marginally stronger. I was ascending toward the last remnant of Imperial purpose on this world. I had to reach that terminal and compile the truth before the entropy below claimed my will entirely. The climb ended not with a view, but with a massive rusted platform, the operational deck of the Vox antenna spire. I hauled myself onto the catwalk, collapsing onto the gritty, spongy metal, my muscles burning with the exhaustion of fighting entropy itself. The rhythmic thump was no longer a distant vibration. It was here. It resonated through the very structure of the platform, a deep, slow thump, thump, thump that seemed to originate from the massive central mechanism of the antenna itself, confirming my theory. This corrupted Imperial relic was the engine of Mortuus's morbid stability. He ignored the agony in my limbs and crawled toward the terminal. The Vox terminal was a colossal, corroded cube of Imperial engineering. Its external plating was thick with rust and pale fungal scarring, resembling a piece of deep-sea salvage. It should have been humming with power, but it was utterly silent, a massive dead monument to forgotten communication. I unclasped the salvaged data slate beneath my robes. It felt dry and clean against the damp decay of the platform, my single, uncorrupted fortress of data. The terminal had an auxiliary splice port, an archaic interface designed for field maintenance. I pulled out the last piece of specialized Imperial equipment I possessed. A thin, hardened data spiker stripped from a defunct auger. The process was agonizing. The spiker would barely fit into the corroded port. I scraped away the rust and spongy growth with the dull edge of my administratum pen, meticulously clearing the port while the rhythmic thump pounded a chaotic rhythm against my skull. Thump, thump, thump. "You will not stop this record," I whispered, driving the data spiker home. A shudder ran through the massive terminal. A single weak red light flickered to life on the console, followed by a low electrical hiss. The system was fighting the decades of decay, desperately attempting to fulfill its function. I patched the data slate into the spiker. My screen immediately flared with the list of data files. Day 780 metrics, postulant catalog, mnemonic fungus analysis. This was the final data entry, the complete unbiased record of Nurgle's terrible piece. I initiated the compilation sequence. The data slate began transferring the information, starting with the horrifying objective measurements, the humidity, the stability of the decay, and the chilling absence of violent conflict. As the data streamed, I looked out from the spire. The world stretched below, a silent, sickening tapestry of sweet, unending rot. The sun, a perpetual green smudge in the low cloud cover, cast no shadows. It was a perfect, stable, dead world. My duty was simple: describe the death. I had to log the soft step ceremony, the comfort of the bloat, the mnemonic fungus that targeted memory, and the preserved guardsman below, proof that Nurgle's victory was one of acceptance, not conquest. The process was slow, agonizingly delayed by the terminal's corrupted processors. Every second felt stolen from the inevitable decay. But the red light on the console remained steady. The Imperial data, however small, however late, was flowing into the dying Vox. I was uploading the world's epitaph, and my final duty as scribe was nearing completion. I watched the screen, fighting the exhaustion. The final, crucial step, The transmission was next, and I realized with a new surge of cold terror that the rhythmic thump wasn't just coming from the terminal's base. It was the sound of the vast antenna pulsing as it fought to generate a carrier wave strong enough to pierce the warp and carry my terrible truth home. I was logging the truth using the very voice that powered the planet's slow, agonizing stability. The compilation was complete. My screen flared green with a confirmation message. Data packet finalized. Size, optimal. I had uploaded the epitaph of Mortuus, the catalog of grief, the analysis of the mnemonic fungus, the horrifying stability metrics, and the full, unvarnished truth of Nurgle's soft perpetual victory. My hand hovered over the final command, initiate transmission. I took a deep, shuddering breath, tasting the cold rust and sweet decay. This was it. The final act of Imperial duty. I activated the command. The Vox terminal, a colossal, corroded machine, roared into a semblance of life. The internal silence was violently shattered by a high-pitched, resonant electrical shriek, the sound of decades of decay fighting against raw power. The weak red light on the console intensified, turning to a blinding, furious amber. The rhythmic thump that had plagued me since Chapter 1 now became violently clear. It wasn't an engine. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was the vast, colossal Vox antenna itself, physically pulsing as it struggled to generate a carrier wave strong enough to pierce the atmospheric saturation and the ambient warp. Static. Thump. 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 The D sound was the physical struggle of the metal tower, fighting entropy to send a signal. I had thought the thump powered the world's decay. I now realized it was the world's last, desperate Imperial struggle to communicate its demise. I was riding the final, agonizing pulse of the planet's voice. On the screen, the status bar crawled forward. Signal integrity, low. Carrier wave. Generation, stressed. The process was slow, delayed by the sheer weight of the surrounding corruption. The very air seemed to push back against the signal. As the data packet reached 50% transmission, the physical strain on the spire became catastrophic. Metal groaned, a sound like tearing flesh, and chunks of pale, spongy fungal matter tore away from the colossal antenna arms, spiraling down into the green gloom below. I braced myself against the console, my heart hammering a frantic human rhythm that mocked the slow, deliberate pulse of the tower. I could feel the structure tearing itself apart to obey my command. 80%. My mind felt unnaturally clear, energized by the intense electrical discharge and the sheer terror of the moment. I had paid the price for the truth, and now the world was paying the price for my transmission. A final, agonizingly loud boom reverberated through the platform. The amber light on the console flickered violently, struggling for survival. The screen froze. Then the final absolute word appeared. Transmission complete. Acknowledgement received. It was done. The truth, the complete, ugly, unvarnished Imperial truth about the stable, morbid victory of Nurgle, was out. It was floating across the void, a grim whisper of data waiting for the attention of a distracted, dying Imperium. Immediately, the light on the console died. The vast electrical shriek ceased. The overwhelming rhythmic thump vanished entirely, replaced by a profound, immediate silence. The dying Vox was dead. The transmission had consumed the last of the local power, leaving me alone on the highest point of a silent, stable, doomed world. I was left with the knowledge that my final duty was complete, and now I had to accept the consequence of having logged the truth. The silence was absolute. It was heavier than the old rhythm of the thump, heavier than the pervasive humidity. The death of the Vox antenna, the consumption of the final local power source left behind a void where the sound of struggle used to be. The dying Vox was truly dead. I stood on the high platform, leaning against the cold, inert bulk of the terminal, watching the final, violent consequences of my transmission. The spire structure was groaning loudly, no longer from power but from collapse. I had minutes before the platform fell. I looked out over the gardens of the dying sun one last time. Below the city was a silent, sickly blanket of green, undisturbed by the massive electrical trauma I had inflicted. Nurgle's victory was so thorough that even planetary sabotage could only cause a local structural failure, not a mass panic. The soft people remained soft and content. My duty was complete. The record was sent. My mission was over, and the inevitable consequence was at hand. As I prepared to accept the long fall, I felt a new sensation. It wasn't pain. Pain was too sharp, too immediate for this world. It was a subtle, unhurried ache in my winged side, and a slow internal pressure. I fumbled with the clasp of my tattered administratum robes and pulled the fabric aside. Beneath the armor plating of my jacket, the skin was unnaturally pale and tender, and there, where the fabric had pressed against my skin during the arduous climb, was a small spongy bloom. It was pale green, soft, and entirely harmless. It pulsed faintly, radiating that same sense of profound comfort and apathy I had felt from the pustulence.
The mnemonic fungus hadn't just been consuming my ledger.
The spores inhaled and absorbed over 780 days had finally found a purchase in my own body. The decay was now internal. I didn't panic. The cold logic of my scribe training intervened one last time. Process initiated. Infection confirmed. Status stable. The psychological comfort I had resisted in Chapter 7 was now an internal inevitability. The erasure of anxiety had begun. I walked to the edge of the catwalk, which was already splitting under the stress, and looked down. The pustulants were too far below to see, but I knew they were there, waiting for the structural failure to claim me. I realized then the final, bitter truth. The imperial logic had survived. The data was sent, but the imperial self was lost. My mind, sharp and focused, had resisted the soft indifference, but my body had accepted the stability. I felt the last frantic flicker of my will, my fear of death, my anxiety over the Ordo's judgment, dissolving under the influence of the internal bloom. The exhaustion was overwhelming, and for the first time in 3 years I felt a profound sense of peace. I sat down on the crumbling catwalk. The hard edges of my duty blurred into the soft reality of the world. The ache in my side was the promise of rest. The record is complete and the scribe is ready for the garden. I was no longer afraid of the rot. I was simply waiting for the inevitable gentle slumber. The long night was over. The Emperor had forgotten this world, and now it was finally at rest. The perpetual autumn had claimed its final flower.